This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Greenbacks and silver. During the war between the states, Lincoln came in conflict with the banking interests who had put him in office. Lincoln wanted to raise money quickly for military expenditures. The agreement between the banks and government was to have the government borrow from them. This was all right with Mr. Lincoln, except the banks were not content with the usual interest. They wanted extremely high interest rates since there was a war. This posed a problem. Lincoln didn't want to pursue an unpopular war or to have to explain to the voters why he was paying exorbitant interest to the banks. The bankers had elected him and felt that they owned him, and they simply refused to modify their demands. Lincoln, in a rush to get things done, did one of the two things that may have cost him his life. He instructed his government to print and issue greenback tallies to pay for wartime purchases. These greenbacks did not go through the banking system. They were printed and issued directly by the government. They were interest-free paper tallies. The operators of the usury system were furious. They felt betrayed. European newspapers carried news items about this revolutionary development. Millions of greenbacks were printed by the government and spent into existence, and not a dime in interest was paid to the banks. In a legal counterattack to protect themselves, the bankers had Congress legislate that the greenbacks were not legal tender for taxes. This meant that they could not be taxed out of circulation, could not be used for interest on the nation's debt, or for import or export duties. In this way, they were able to drive their value down to 30% of par. Still, this was a dangerous precedent for the entire concept of interest banking. People had begun to demand that the government replace all interest-bearing debt to the banks with interest-free greenbacks. It would save tens of millions in interest each year and could free the nation from the usury net. Lincoln was killed. Immediately, the banking system demanded that the offending greenbacks be retired. As the supply of greenbacks dwindled, it forced debtors to borrow interest-bearing replacement money into existence from the banks. A money shortage developed, causing a panic in the stock market. 10,000 businesses failed. To get some money into the hands of the people, the, quote, Act of 1873 was passed, allowing anyone who had silver to present it to a government mint and have it minted into, quote, trade dollars. These silver trade dollars were given legal tender status. Taxes could be paid with them. Everyone who had any silver at all immediately brought it in to be minted. Almost overnight, silver dollars appeared everywhere. Leather pocketbooks for men came into vogue to handle the increased weight of the money. At the same time this was going on, Germany went off the silver standard and on the gold standard. This created additional surplus silver, which flooded America and helped cause the silver price to decline. For a time, debtors had money to pay their debts. The banks, again confronted with something which threatened to ruin their monopoly, brought their forces to bear to have this act repealed in time to save mortgages from being paid. 1874 to 1876, the Greenback Party. The Greenback Party became a force in American politics. This party was made up of debtors who wanted the repeal of the Redemption Act that was taking greenbacks out of existence and leaving the country without money. This movement was successful. The law to repeal the Redemption Act passed in 1875. But since the borrowing government was servant to the lender banks, the law was simply ignored. They continued to retire greenbacks out of existence. The Depression grew deeper and deeper and didn't reach bottom until the beginning of the war phase in 1896, 32 long years after commodities had peaked in 1864. Islam in Europe. Islam made a great impression on the rulers of Europe by its rapid conquests of Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, Spain, and its invasion of France in the heartland of the West, so narrowly turned back at Tours. Following this effort, a new invasion of Europe was commenced by the Turks in the East. Their first great success was the capture of the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople, and the massacre of its defenders. This invasion was tremendously successful as it progressed northward up the Danube Valley. It reached the walls of Vienna, spreading a wide path of death and destruction in its path. It was in fighting this invasion that Captain John Smith made his reputation. Almost 100 years later, the issue was still in balance. It wasn't until 1683 that the Polish cavalry lifted the siege. This marked the high tide of Muslim conquests in Europe. Millions of Slav Samaritans, however, had passed under Islamic rule. These captives belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church. All the free nations of Europe, Christian and Samaritan, aided in the defense of Vienna in order to halt the march of the dread Muslims. It was the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Nordic Tsars of Russia, who led the series of Slav-Turkish wars. They were inconceivably brutal. The Turks considered the wars to be a continuation of the Crusades. They started small, but ended up involving most of Europe and the Middle East. 1812 to 1833, the Greek War of Independence. In April 1821, Archbishop Germanos raised the standard of the cross as a signal for a general rising of the Slavs of Greece. This beginning of the war was marked by the advance of peasants marching against the Turks armed with clubs, scythes, and slings. These Greeks assaulted Turkish strongpoints and put their defenders to the sword. The war was marked by massacres of Turks by Greeks and Greeks by Turks. Everywhere was repeated the same scenes of butchery. In September, the citadel of Tripolitsa was taken by storm. The Greek general rode in triumph through the streets carpeted with Turkish dead. At the end of the parade, 2,000 prisoners of all ages and sexes were slaughtered. The whole tone of the war was one of mutual extermination. 1824. This Greek revolt, financed by Western banks, showed surprising strength and resilience. The newly purchased armaments had their effect, and the Turkish Sultan reluctantly despaired of suppressing the insurrection himself. He summoned to his aid Mehmet Ali Pasha of Egypt. These allied Islamic peoples proceeded to exterminate Slav resistance throughout Greece. 1827. In February, the Greek government borrowed more money from European banks. Soon thereafter, the Albanian Turkish garrison surrendered to the Greeks on terms. They too were massacred as they were marched away under escort. Despite these setbacks to the Islamic cause, the combined forces of Turkey and Egypt were turning Greece into a vast cemetery. Pacification was in sight. A reconquest of Greece by the Turks would have defaulted the loans made to the Greek revolutionaries by Western banks. To halt this approaching economic debacle, British and French warships were sent into the harbor of Navarino to attack the Turks. Victory in the resulting battle, combined with a successful Russian land campaign, ensured Greek independence and the safety of their loans to Western banks. 1854, the Crimean War. The Turks were the only ones left in this part of the world not deeply in debt to the Western banks. When the next disagreement started between the Russians and Turks, England and France switched and aligned themselves on the side of the Islamic Turks. This allowed them to extend loans to a new customer. This war was a revelation to the Western soldiers who did the actual fighting. Their new allies, the Turks, were long on promises of aid, but when the fighting erupted, they were nowhere to be seen. Westerners were left to fight the Slavs. It was as fatal to leave the Christian wounded in the hands of friendly infidel allies as it was the Russian Slav enemy. British soldiers wrote home outraged that on the battlefield of Alma, the savage Slavic foe combed the battlefield searching out wounded Britons to kill. Officers complained that British medics were often attacked and killed by the wounded Russian soldiers they were trying to aid. These reports of Slav treatment of Westerners who had fallen into their power were confirmed many times over during the World Wars I and II. At Stalingrad, 250,000 German soldiers were surrendered to the Slavs. Only 8,000 came home after the war. After World War II, many millions of Westerners living in Slavic islands in the east were uprooted and sent trekking westward to their own people. Millions died of mistreatment, starvation, and exposure en route. Gomer's Press in the West will not discuss the atrocity. The War of 1877 to 1878 between Russia and Turkey was triggered by the continued oppression of the Slavic subjects of the Sultan. Turkey had promised to grant better treatment to their captive Slav populations after the Crimean War, but the following years brought no changes. In 1875, an insurrection broke out in Herzegovina and Montenegro, to be followed by Serbia, openly taking up arms against Turkey. Russia, the longtime ally of the rebels by reason of race and religion, joined in. Russian Slav volunteers flocked in great numbers to join the Serbian Slavs. This culminated in Slavic Romania declaring her independence. Bulgaria, another Slavic land, also became independent. The Mohammedan world was fast losing their booty of conquered Slavic peoples and lands. The two main lessons to be learned from the Slav-Saracen confrontations are: 1. Confrontations between these two are absolutely ruthless. They are the actions of those who do not have the law in their hearts. 2. The Saracens will make treaties with or against either the Slav or the Christian West as it suits their needs, in spite of the enmity which runs deep against both. 1881. Bankers used European armies to force Turkey to pay them the revenues from government salt and tobacco monopolies, taxes on fishing and spirits, and raw silk production. They even took the annual tribute paid by Bulgaria to Turkey. The bankers, in effect, ruled Turkey for the next 25 years. 1896, bottom side transition year. The commodity prices bottomed out. The war phase started. William Jennings Bryan attempted to ease the shortage of money by advocating free coinage of silver. Anyone with a mine could take their silver to a bank and exchange it for legal tender. Free coinage and cheap money was the issue. Mark Hanna, William McKinley's campaign manager, easily collected $4 million from banks and corporations to stop the free coinage issue. If debtors could obtain legal tender to pay their debts, the banks could not foreclose. McKinley won. 1892. France sent a battleship to aid the French-owned National Bank in Santo Domingo to foreclose debtors. 1898. The U.S. minister in Spain knew that Spain would give up Cuba, might even cede it to the U.S. His knowledge was ignored. The U.S. warship Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana, Cuba. American politicians disclaimed a desire for a new territory. Money was immediately borrowed into existence to expand the armed forces. M1 money supply is up by 13%. As they said at the time, it was a splendid little war. 1899, money supply up by 17%. The British did their part by invading South Africa and started the Boer War. 1904, Santo Domingo threatened default of $32 million. President Theodore Roosevelt sent in troops, took over 55% of that country's custom revenues for repayment of debts. He sent troops into Nicaragua and Haiti for the same reasons. Wars began to break out all over the world. The Russo-Japanese War, the Philippine insurrection, the war cycle was in full stride, as borrowed money again flowed and debtors were able to pay their debts and borrow still more money into existence to buy fantastic bargains before the prices again rose. Actually, if a person could have borrowed enough money, he could have become rich. Those who were verging on bankruptcy and unable to pay any more on their mortgages were saved by the fresh flow of money from the war borrowing. This era outdid itself with a war of all wars, World War I, an entire world at war, money being borrowed at a fantastic rate, public and private. Increase in M1 money supply, 1915 was up by 7%. By 1916, it was up by 19%. 1917, another 19% up. By 1918, it was up by 10%. 1919, it was up by 16%. And 1920, was up by 12%. This enabled the world to pay on their older debts while adding new ones, a splendidly profitable age, except for the widows in black and the shattered survivors who could not seem to understand why.